Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. I recently got a message from a mysterious individual known as Epsilon 7466 MK2. He provided me a 2-page document defending the Empire's destruction of Alderaan. He had two main points he wanted to get across. First, that the Empire technically wasn't responsible for the destruction of Alderaan. It's an interesting point of view, and I'll explain a little bit more later in the video. And the second portion of his document outlines why Alderaan was actually a legitimate military target. While I don't agree with some of the things that Epsilon brought up in his document, I do have to say that this is a really interesting thought exercise, so thank you for that, Epsilon. The destruction of Alderaan is widely hailed as a horrendous act by the Empire. Even those who are more sympathetic to the Imperial cause point out that the needless destruction of this planet caused growing sympathy for the rebel movement, and eventually inspired mass defections to the rebellion, especially amongst Imperial Navy pilots. Every small action has its consequences, and destroying an entire planet creates a ton of unexpected consequences, and if you're a ruler, it's really the last thing you want to do, create more chaos. But is there a defense for the Empire's actions here? Or a better way to ask this question is, why did they do this in the first place? It's easy to call a heinous attack like this evil and just leave it at that. But words like evil excuse us from thinking rationally and really studying an issue. Words like evil usually oversimplify what are very complex situations. And the destruction of Alderaan and the decisions leading up to the destruction of Alderaan are quite complex. And oftentimes alongside evil, you'll find other sins like incompetence, poor structure and organization, and more understandable human emotions like greed or selfishness. I'm someone who really believes that when dealing with an opponent, you really have to remove emotion from the equation and try to be as rational as possible, even if they are being led by someone who by most people's standards considers an evil space wizard. So first, we're going to take a look at Epsilon's second point. Alderaan was a legitimate military target. This is the way the Empire wanted to sell the destruction of Alderaan, as a military engagement and not just as the simple destruction of a peaceful planet. And at the core of this argument would be the Organas, the royal family which ruled, governed, and represented Alderaan at the time. The patriarch of that family, Viceroy and later Senator Bail Organa, had watched in horror as the galaxy ripped itself apart during the Clone Wars, and then watched in horror as Supreme Chancellor Palpatine refused to relinquish power after the conflict and established the Galactic Empire. Bail Organa was in a unique position. As a senator and diplomat, he had free reign to travel across the entire galaxy with limited impunity from the Imperial security services. There was a certain level of respect and diplomatic immunity given to individuals like him, which meant that his personal diplomatic cruiser's cargo hold was rarely ever searched, and there were very few restrictions about where he could travel. This unprecedented freedom gave Bail Organa the opportunity to set up the foundations of the Rebel Alliance completely unharassed. He would stash supplies and weapons on remote worlds. He would allow Imperial shipments of ships and military supplies accidentally get lost and turn up in rebel hands. He even enlisted his own daughter to help him in this venture. The famous Lightmaker Hammerhead corvette that was used so efficiently at the Battle of Scarif was an Alderaanian Smyrna-class Hammerhead corvette that was used to deliver relief supplies to Lothal, where it was conveniently stolen by the rebel unit Phoenix Cell. Bail Organa was also responsible for securing a shipment of UT-60D U-Wings for the rebellion, which again were used during the Battle of Scarif. Bail Organa even used his own diplomatic security staff as the backbone for the early Rebel Alliance's security force. There's nothing clandestine about his actions, at least amongst his own people, and that's because he had the loyalty of his people. Equally as important, Bail Organa had the resources of his house and the backing of the Alderaanian monarch, Queen Briha, who also happened to be his wife. And it was thanks to these riches hidden on Alderaan that the rebels had a harder time finding fighters than they did funding them. Bail Organa would also help run the fledgling Rebel intelligence services, using operatives like Ahsoka Tano and Alexander Kallus to gather intel on the Empire to keep the rebels one step ahead of their enemy. There's a reason why a lot of people call Bail Organa the father of the rebellion, because he basically set up everything. We also have to realize in the early Empire period, there were still many transitions that the Empire needed to undergo until it reached its final chaotic form. Yes, Sheev Palpatine was the Emperor. That didn't mean institutions like the Galactic Senate were completely dysfunctional. Yes, a lot of the senators that opposed Palpatine had been purged and jailed, some were killed, others were sent to work camps, especially those who signed the Petition of 2000 in the waning moments of the Republic. But some oppositional figures like Bail Organa and Mon Mothma understood how to play the game properly. Bail Organa was smart enough to hide his real intentions and political views. He even maintained cordial relationships with Imperial higher-ups like Moff Wilhuv Tarkin. Ironically, there's this one incident where Tarkin's ship broke down in orbit above Alderaan, and he was actually invited to the Organa's palace for dinner. It wasn't really until the heist on Aldhani, followed by the Public Order Resentencing Directive, when the ISB would take the lead in hunting down the rebellion, that things get a bit more complicated. Suddenly, Bail Organa couldn't just pull rank on witless Imperial Army officers or, corrupt Imperial officials. The ISB, which was a relatively small civilian intelligence agency, suddenly became one of the most powerful entities in the entire galaxy, and their sole purpose right now was to destroy individuals just like Bail Organa. Now, the Empire would go after Mon Mothma first, as she would use her position in the Senate to challenge Emperor Palpatine in his massacre of the Gorman people. Mon Mothma would flee Coruscant with the help of the rebellion and make an official declaration for the Rebel Alliance. This only increased the danger for individuals like Bail Organa. Despite giving up his seat in the Senate to Princess Leia, something that his enemies could have labeled as nepotism, he was still very active politically, and he continued to raise funds to get relief supplies to individuals who were escaping the wrath of the Empire. Alderaan has a long history of supporting refugees. It was one of the main places to which people could escape to during the Clone Wars and find refuge. But now the Imperial narrative had changed. The refugees that were now flooding to Alderaan were not described as victims, but potential traitors against the Empire. I remember, guys, prior to the destruction of Alderaan, there was still quite a lot of public support for the Empire, especially because Palpatine was widely seen as the savior of the Republic during the Clone Wars. That appreciation, that nationalism would not wear off until many years after the Clone Wars. But here's the thing, even at the height of Bail Organa's rebel activities, Alderaan was never really a staging ground for a rebel attack. There were never huge stockpiles of ships and munitions or training camps for rebel troopers and pilots. Organa wasn't dumb. He spread the rebellion's resources across many Outer Rim territories and remote space stations. And so while it was easy to make a case that Bail Organa was a traitor, to destroy an entire planet with the history and culture that Alderaan had was ultimately one of the dumbest things the Galactic Empire could have done. Now, Epsilon brings up a good point. If Bail Organa had rebelled openly against Alderaan, it would have been extremely difficult for the Empire to carry out a successful ground invasion. A planet as rich as Alderaan most likely will have a planetary shield, and they actually should have a pretty robust planetary defense force, despite being so pacifist. It's just not very easy to suppress the Alderaanians. They were free people. And the Sith found out that the hard way during the Old Republic era. But still, that doesn't really justify the destruction of the entire planet. Just because you can't subdue it from orbit with a giant laser doesn't mean you have to blow up everything. I mean, I don't think the public would appreciate that kind of heavy-handed tactic. The only way Alderaan, the planet, could have been considered a legitimate target for the Death Star would be if it had some super weapon built into it, just like the Death Star, capable of destroying entire worlds. Even if there was a heavy rebel presence on the planet, even if there were multiple stockpiles of weapons and ships, again, it still does not present that big of a danger to justify its destruction. Guardian planets like Alderaan were exceptionally hard to find in the galaxy, and so to get rid of one simply because there is one, rebel leader on it runs completely counter to Emperor Palpatine's promises he made to the galaxy when he took over. He was supposed to bring peace and prosperity, not death and destruction. And so this was an extremely unpopular move by the Empire. Only the most diehard and brainwashed Imperial supporters actually enjoyed seeing this happen. So, was Alderaan potentially a legitimate target for ISB officers to launch a raid on? Yeah, I think so. If you take a look at the evidence, Bail Organa is clearly involved with the rebellion. I'd go as far to say that the Empire could even bring a naval force over the planet and blockade it, prevent any more rebels from escaping or flying to Alderaan. But that's really as far as I would go as far as legitimate target. Any kind of destructive force used on the planet, whether it's destroying the entire planet or just orbital bombardment, would be exceptionally unpopular amongst the populace. No one can really justify that sort of action. Now, the other part of Epsilon's analysis is quite interesting. He points out that the destruction of Alderaan was not actually something the Emperor called for. It wasn't like an order that came down from the chain of command. It wasn't as if Wilhuv Tarkin asked Palpatine for permission to blow up the planet. He sort of just went ahead on his own and did it. And this is kind of how the Empire worked. Like a lot of totalitarian dictators, Emperor Palpatine had to destroy the institutions that kept his power in check. He had to corrupt the judiciary, destroy the Jedi and flood the Senate with his sycophants. Such purges usually got rid of competent individuals and filled them instead with yes-men. And so these former institutions from the Republic era were now completely gutted and unable to perform a lot of the duties that they were supposed to. But the galaxy still needed to be run, and so Palpatine instead relied on a hand-picked group of essentially henchmen and thugs who were smarter than your average bootlicker and ambitious in their own ways. You had individuals like Grand Admiral Thrawn, Darth Vader, Wraith Senior, Orson Krennic, and of course, Wilhuff Tarkin. These were the hands of the Emperor, so to speak. These individuals were given massive amounts of power and tasked with solving the most pressing matters facing the Empire. Of course, like a true dictator, Emperor Palpatine rarely gave out policy speeches himself. Instead, he relied on his underlings to fight amongst each other for power and submit their own plans and operations for him to approve. In a normal government, if one of your Grand Moffs or governors uses a super laser to kill a science director and take out an entire garrison of Imperial troopers, that would usually end up with the Grand Moff getting fired. But for a Sith, this was just normal behavior. Use the tools given to you to win at all costs if necessary. And that is kind of who Moff Wilhuff Tarkin was. Despite not being a Sith, he was raised up with a great deal of fear and hatred. As a young boy, as part of his family's coming to age ceremony, he was sent into the wild with no supplies and forced to survive in a biome full of alien lions and other apex predators. This really taught Tarkin everything he needed to know. This guy was tough as bones. Oh, also, an interesting side note, in the Legends version of the Gorman Massacre, what happens is Wilhuff Tarkin arrives on Gorman and he finds protesters basically covering his landing pad. And so he proceeds to tell his pilot to land their ship on the protesters, turning that protest into a massacre. Tarkin also developed the Tarkin Doctrine, a military and political strategy that depended on threat of force to keep the galaxy in line. Now, I'm not really sure how Palpatine felt about plans such as this, but that's kind of the point. No one is supposed to really know, and that's because if Tarkin fails, it suddenly becomes Tarkin's failure, not the Emperor's failure. The destruction of Alderaan wasn't Palpatine's decision, but the decision of a rogue Imperial Moff who was extremely power-hungry and destructive. By stepping into the shadows, Emperor Palpatine could take responsibility for all of the Empire's victories and not take responsibilities for all of its mistakes. But you see, that's not what happened, actually. Palpatine did not even try to cover up the destruction of Alderaan. Instead, he decides to crack down on all of the remaining Alderaanians in the galaxy. It's a vindictive mood, but it's also a move that is driven by immense fear. Palpatine by this point was already a shadow of his former self. At one time, he was an extremely capable politician, able to read public sentiment in uncanny ways. But as Emperor of the Galactic Empire, Palpatine lost his connection with the people and failed to understand just how grievous a mistake the destruction of Alderaan was for the Empire. So there you have it, guys. Thank you, Epsilon, for sending me your analysis. It was fun to read through it, and I feel like this was a really fun thought exercise. Let me know in the comment section below what you guys think, though. Did the Empire really mess up by blowing Alderaan? Was it a legitimate military target? Also, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy. I'll see you next time.